August 19, 1942. The sky above occupied France erupted in a ballet of death as Oberleutnant Franz Stigler watched a formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses lumber across the horizon like wounded elephants struggling through deep snow. He had heard rumors about these American bombers for months, whispered in the ready rooms of Luftwaffe bases from Abbeville to Berlin, but nothing prepared him for the reality of engaging them in combat. The Americans had finally arrived in force, and the German fighter pilots who had dominated European skies for 3 years were about to discover that their war had fundamentally changed. Stigler pushed his Messerschmitt Bf 109 into a climbing turn, his gloved hand steady on the control column despite the ice forming at 25,000 feet. Below him, the French countryside looked peaceful, almost serene, completely divorced from the industrial slaughter unfolding in the stratosphere. As he closed the distance to the bomber formation, his radio crackled with the excited voices of his squadron mates, their commentary a mixture of tactical observations and grudging admiration. "They fly straight and level," Hauptmann Wilhelm Meyer transmitted, his voice tight with concentration. "No evasive maneuvers. Either they are incredibly brave or incredibly stupid." The truth, as Stigler would later write in his combat diary, was far more complex than simple courage or foolishness. The Americans brought to the European theater a fundamentally different philosophy of aerial warfare, one that prioritized formation discipline and mutual protection over the individualistic dogfighting tactics that had defined the Luftwaffe's early victories. German pilots, raised on the teachings of Oswald Boelcke and Manfred von Richthofen, had spent years perfecting the art of single combat, the lone wolf-hunting prey across empty skies. The Americans, by contrast, approached bombing missions with an almost industrial mindset, treating their aircraft as components in a larger machine designed to deliver maximum ordnance on target regardless of cost. As Stigler made his first firing pass, tracers from a dozen 50-caliber machine guns converged on his position, filling the air with deadly geometry. He broke hard left, feeling the Messerschmitt shudder as rounds punched through his left wing. The defensive firepower was staggering, far beyond anything he had experienced fighting British bombers. Each flying fortress bristled with 13 heavy machine guns, and they flew in tight formations specifically designed to create overlapping fields of fire that could shred any fighter foolish enough to approach from predictable angles. According to records from the German Air Ministry archived in the Bundesarchiv Militararchiv, Luftwaffe intelligence officers initially estimated that engaging American bomber formations would result in pilot losses 3 times higher than similar operations against Royal Air Force bombers. Stigler pulled away from the formation, his heart hammering against his ribs, and took stock of the situation. 2 of his squadron mates were already spiraling earthward, trailing black smoke. The Americans had lost 1 bomber, its right wing crumpled by cannon fire, but the remaining aircraft maintained their rigid formation, continuing toward their target as though nothing had happened. This was the American way, he realized, the manifestation of a national character that valued persistence and material superiority over tactical finesse. They would accept horrific casualties, absorb punishment that would break other air forces, and simply replace their losses with new aircraft and fresh crews flowing across the Atlantic in an endless industrial tide. The engagement lasted another 12 minutes, though to Stigler it felt like hours. When the bombers finally disappeared into the eastern haze, limping toward England with several engines feathered and fuselages riddled with holes, he counted his remaining aircraft. 4 had gone down. The squadron had claimed 3 confirmed kills and possibly 2 more, but the mathematics were troubling. The Americans could afford this exchange rate indefinitely. Germany could not. January 7, 1943. Major Günter Rall stood in the operations room of Jagdgeschwader 52, studying reconnaissance photographs of the latest American bombing raid on Wilhelmshaven. The damage was extensive, but what troubled him more than the burning oil refineries was the growing sophistication of American tactics. In the 5 months since their first tentative raids, the Americans had learned quickly, adapting to Luftwaffe defenses with a speed that surprised even the most experienced German commanders. The crews flying those bombers were no longer the green novices of August. They had been baptized in fire over France and Germany, and those who survived had become formidable adversaries. Raoul had fought on the Eastern Front, where he had achieved most of his 275 confirmed victories against Soviet aircraft. The Russians fought with desperate courage, but often lacked the training and equipment to match German pilots in single combat. The Americans were different. They possessed excellent aircraft, thorough training, and most importantly, an organizational system that treated aerial combat as a science rather than an art. This methodical approach, initially derided by German pilots as unimaginative, was proving devastatingly effective in the grinding arithmetic of attrition warfare. They learn from their mistakes, Raoul observed to his assembled pilots, tapping the photographs with a wooden pointer. Notice how they vary their approach altitudes now? They use diversionary formations to split our fighter response. Their escort fighters have extended their range. He paused, meeting the eyes of each man in the room. We must abandon any notion that these Americans are inferior pilots. They are simply different pilots, and increasingly dangerous ones. This represented a significant shift in German military thinking. The early German assessment of American airmen had been colored by cultural prejudice and strategic miscalculation. Many Luftwaffe officers, educated in the Prussian tradition that emphasized individual prowess and martial nobility, had initially viewed American pilots as products of a soft, commercialized society unsuited for the rigors of aerial combat. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels reinforced this narrative in public statements, dismissing American military capabilities as the inevitable result of mongrel democracy and Jewish influence. But in the ready rooms and officers' clubs, where survival depended on accurate intelligence rather than ideological comfort, a more nuanced understanding was emerging. Oberstleutnant Johann Steinhoff, who commanded Jägerschwader 77 through some of the bloodiest air battles over Germany, later recalled in his memoirs that German pilots developed a peculiar respect for their American opponents, a grudging admiration born from shared danger and professional recognition. The Americans flew into withering anti-aircraft fire and fighter attacks with the same grim determination that characterized German infantry assaults on the Eastern Front. They absorbed catastrophic losses, some missions losing more than 20% of participating aircraft, yet returned the next day with the same formations, the same tactics, the same relentless pressure. We called them the chain dogs, Steinhoff wrote in his post-war autobiography, using the German term for soldiers bound by iron discipline to hopeless positions, not as an insult but as acknowledgement of their incredible fortitude. They were chained to their formations, chained to their mission profiles, unable or unwilling to break away even when attacked from advantageous positions. This made them predictable, which we exploited, but it also made them unstoppable in aggregate. German intelligence officers conducted extensive debriefings of captured American aircrew, and these interrogations revealed pilots who were generally well-educated, technically proficient, and motivated by a complex mixture of patriotism, duty, and simple survival instinct. Unlike the mythic warrior heroes celebrated in German propaganda, American pilots tended to view aerial combat as a dangerous job that needed completion rather than an opportunity for personal glory. This prosaic attitude, combined with superior numbers and industrial capacity, was gradually winning the air war over Europe. March 23, 1943. Hauptmann Heinrich Ehrler circled his damaged Focke-Wulf FW-190 at 8,000 feet, nursing the fighter back toward its base near Oldenburg. Below him, smoke rose from a crashed B-17, the bomber having finally succumbed to the concentrated cannon fire that had shredded its tail section. It was Ehrler's 19th confirmed victory, but the engagement had left him deeply troubled about the trajectory of the air war. He had expended nearly all his ammunition destroying that single bomber, and in the process, 2 of his wingmen had been shot down by American escort fighters that appeared with increasing frequency over German territory. The technical quality of American aircraft had become a subject of intense discussion among Luftwaffe pilots. The B-17, nicknamed the Flying Fortress, was not particularly fast or maneuverable, but its robust construction allowed it to absorb damage that would destroy most German bombers. Ehrler had personally witnessed B-17s returning to England with entire sections of fuselage shot away, engines destroyed, and control surfaces barely functional. The aircraft seemed to embody American industrial philosophy, over-engineered, redundant, designed for survival rather than elegance. German engineers, by contrast, had prioritized performance and efficiency, creating aircraft that were magnificent in the hands of skilled pilots but less forgiving of battle damage or pilot error. American fighter aircraft presented a different challenge. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, which began appearing in significant numbers over Europe in spring 1943, was initially dismissed by German pilots as too large and ungainly for effective fighter combat. Weighing more than 7 tons fully loaded, the Thunderbolt seemed to violate every principle of fighter design that had governed Luftwaffe thinking. Yet in combat, the massive American fighter proved surprisingly capable. Its 850 caliber machine guns delivered devastating firepower, its turbocharged engine provided excellent high-altitude performance, and most critically, its robust airframe could withstand battle damage that would doom lighter fighters. "The Thunderbolt is like fighting a flying tank," Major Walther Dahl observed in a report to the Fighter Command Staff, a document now preserved in the National Archives and Records Administration in College Park, Maryland. "It cannot turn with our Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs, but it doesn't need to." The American pilots used their superior speed and dive performance to engage on their terms, then escape before we can bring our maneuverability advantages to bear. They have clearly studied our tactics and developed effective counters. This represented a fundamental shift in the tactical balance. For the first 3 years of the war, German fighter pilots had enjoyed qualitative superiority over most opponents. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf FW-190 were excellent aircraft flown by superbly trained pilots who had refined their skills in combat over Poland, France, Britain, and Russia. But the Americans were closing the gap with frightening speed, not through individual virtuosity, but through systematic application of industrial and tactical advantages. Their pilots received more training than their German counterparts, often logging 300 hours before entering combat compared to less than 200 for Luftwaffe pilots by 1943. American aircraft benefited from cutting-edge technology, better radios, more effective gun sights, improved engines, and crucially, seemingly unlimited supplies of high-octane fuel. German test pilots who evaluated captured American aircraft produced detailed technical reports that circulated through the Luftwaffe command structure. These assessments, while noting specific weaknesses in individual designs, consistently emphasized the overall quality and thoughtful engineering of American aviation technology. The P-51 Mustang, which appeared in the European theater in late 1943, represented a quantum leap in long-range escort fighter capability. Powered by a British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine built under license in America, the Mustang combined speed, range, and maneuverability in a package that German fighters could not match at most altitudes. Oberst Adolf Galland, who commanded all Luftwaffe fighter forces from 1941 to 1945, famously remarked after the war that seeing Mustangs escorting bombers all the way to Berlin was the moment he knew Germany had lost the air war. The statement reflected not just technical appreciation but a broader understanding that American industrial and organizational capabilities had overwhelmed German tactical excellence. July 4, 1943? Lieutenant Werner Schroer watched from his cockpit as a damaged B-24 Liberator struggled to maintain altitude over Bavaria, trailing smoke from 2 engines. His ammunition was exhausted, his fuel running low, but he held formation with the crippled bomber, studying the men visible through shattered windows and torn aluminum. They were trying desperately to reach neutral Switzerland, visible as a promise of safety just 40 miles to the south. Schroer could see the waist gunner slumped over his weapon, probably dead, and the pilot wrestling with controls that barely responded. These were not faceless enemies or propaganda caricatures. They were men fighting for their lives with the same desperation that motivated German pilots when circumstances reversed. This recognition of shared humanity, paradoxical in the midst of industrialized killing, became increasingly common as the air war intensified. German pilots who engaged American bombers day after day, watching them burn and fall, also observed countless acts of courage that transcended national boundaries. They saw pilots holding dying aircraft steady so their crews could bail out, They witnessed mid-air collisions when damaged bombers fell into formations, sacrificing themselves to spare their squadron mates. They respected the discipline of gunners who continued firing even as their aircraft disintegrated around them. War had not eliminated human decency. It had simply made it more precious and more tragic. The most famous example of this mutual recognition occurred on December 20th, 1942, when Oberleutnant Franz Stigler encountered a badly damaged B-17 flown by Second Lieutenant Charles Brown near the German coastline. The bomber was shot to pieces, barely airborne, its crew wounded and helpless. Stigler pulled alongside and could see through the shattered fuselage that the men were incapacitated, the aircraft held aloft only through Brown's desperate skill. Instead of delivering the killing shots that would have brought his confirmed victories to 27, Stigler made a decision that would haunt and define the rest of his life. He escorted the bomber to the North Sea, then saluted and peeled away, allowing his enemy to escape. "I could not kill them," Stigler later explained when he and Brown reunited nearly 50 years after the war. "It would have been like shooting at men in parachutes. They were no longer a threat, just human beings trying to get home." This incident, while exceptional in its details, reflected an attitude more common than official narratives acknowledged. Many German pilots, particularly those from the pre-Nazi generation who had been raised with traditional codes of military honor, struggled with the moral dimensions of aerial warfare. They were not fighting enemy soldiers on a battlefield, but often shooting at men who were burning alive or falling through freezing sky. American prisoners of war who ended up in German Luftwaffe camps generally reported better treatment than those captured by other German military branches, a distinction that reflected the peculiar culture of fighter-pilot communities. According to records maintained by the American Prisoners of War Organization and documented in various post-war testimonies, Luftwaffe interrogators often treated captured American aircrew with professional courtesy, sometimes even discussing tactics and aircraft performance with their prisoners once formal interrogations concluded. This was not universal war crimes occurred, particularly as Germany's situation deteriorated, but presented a persistent undercurrent of professional respect between opposing airmen. Oberst Joachim Massea, before his death in September 1942, wrote letters to his family describing encounters with downed Allied pilots. He expressed admiration for their courage while maintaining that his duty required him to shoot them down. This complicated emotional landscape, where respect coexisted with lethal intent, characterized much of the fighter pilot experience on both sides. The men trying to kill each other at 25,000 feet often had more in common with each other than with their own ground forces. They shared the same fears, the same exhilaration, the same nightmares about burning alive in a falling aircraft. October 9, 1943. Major Erich Hartmann read the latest propaganda pamphlet distributed by the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda with barely concealed contempt. The document, filled with cartoonish depictions of cowardly American pilots bombing civilians and fleeing from heroic German fighters, bore no resemblance to the war Hartmann was actually fighting. He had just returned from his second mission of the day, both involving desperate battles against American P-38s that had killed 3 of his squadron mates. The Americans he encountered were neither cowardly nor incompetent. They were dangerous, well-equipped, and increasingly numerous. The disconnect between propaganda and reality created profound dissonance for German pilots who had to reconcile official narratives with their lived experience. Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry insisted on portraying American pilots as gangsters, mercenaries, and terror bombers deliberately targeting German civilians. This narrative served multiple purposes. It justified continued resistance, maintained home front morale, and dehumanized the enemy to make killing easier. But for men who actually fought Americans, who saw their tactics evolve and their courage manifest in combat, such crude propaganda was worse than useless. It was dangerous, breeding complacency and underestimation of a formidable enemy. German newsreels shown in cinemas across the Reich featured dramatic footage of American bombers falling from the sky, their crews depicted as criminals receiving just punishment for attacking innocent German cities. The reality was more complex and far more troubling for Germany's strategic position. Yes, American bombers were falling in significant numbers. The raid on Schweinfurt in August 1943 saw 60 B-17s shot down in a single day, but the losses did nothing to slow the American offensive. New bombers and fresh crews arrived constantly, and with each mission the Americans refined their tactics and extended their fighter coverage. They treat losses like a factory treats defective products, Hauptmann Heinz Nock observed in his diary, entries later published in his memoir. They calculate acceptable loss rates, absorb them, and continue operations. There is something both admirable and terrible about such ruthless pragmatism. This industrial approach to warfare represented the fundamental divide between American and German military philosophy. Germany, with its limited resources and population, needed to win decisively and quickly. America, with its vast industrial base and manpower reserves, could afford to trade losses for incremental advantages, grinding down German resistance through sheer material superiority. The propaganda also obscured genuine German concerns about American bombing targeting. While official statements condemned Americans for terror bombing, internal Luftwaffe assessments recognized that American daylight precision bombing, despite its limitations, was strategically more dangerous than British night area bombing. The Americans targeted specific industrial facilities, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, synthetic oil refineries. When they hit these targets, even partially, the effects rippled through Germany's war economy. According to post-war analysis by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, precision attacks on petroleum facilities in particular came close to paralyzing German military operations by early 1945. German pilots saw the effects firsthand. Fuel allocations shrank, flight training was curtailed. Advanced aircraft designs remained grounded because the fuel needed to power them simply didn't exist. Major Günter Rauhl recalled being issued just 20 minutes of fuel for combat patrols in early 1945, barely enough to take off, engage enemy aircraft, and land. The Americans had not defeated the Luftwaffe in traditional air-to-air combat so much as they had destroyed the infrastructure that sustained it. This was warfare as industrial process, and it was devastatingly effective. Yet even as their strategic situation deteriorated, German pilots maintained remarkable combat effectiveness when they could get airborne. The introduction of jet-powered Messerschmitt May 262s in late 1944 demonstrated that German technical innovation remained world-class. These revolutionary aircraft could outrun and outclimb any Allied fighter, and in the hands of experienced pilots they devastated American bomber formations. But there were never enough jets, never enough fuel, never enough time to train replacement pilots in their operation. January 15, 1945, Oberleutnant Heinz Baer brought his Me 262 in for landing at Lechfeld Air Base, his hands trembling slightly as reaction set in. He had just shot down 2 P-51 Mustangs in a single engagement, bringing his total confirmed victories to 220, but the triumph felt hollow. Around him, Germany was collapsing. The Luftwaffe that had terrorized Europe from 1939 to 1942 was now reduced to scattered units fighting a desperate defensive war against overwhelming odds. The Americans no longer came in dozens of bombers escorted by a handful of fighters. They came in hundreds, sometimes thousands, with escorts that now enjoyed numerical superiority over German defenders. The transformation in German pilot attitudes toward Americans reflected this broader strategic collapse. In 1942, captured documents and interrogation reports showed German pilots often expressing confidence, even arrogance about their superiority. By 1945, those same sources revealed exhaustion, frustration, and grudging acknowledgement that the Americans had not just matched German capabilities, but exceeded them in crucial ways. It was no longer possible to blame losses on numerical disadvantage alone. American pilots in 1945 were better trained, better equipped, and more experienced than their predecessors 3 years earlier. Major Gerhard Barkhorn, who survived the war as the second highest-scoring ace in history with 301 confirmed victories, later described the evolution of American tactics with professional admiration tinged with bitterness. By 1945, he recalled in post-war interviews, American formations were virtually unassailable by conventional means. They had learned to coordinate bomber defenses with escort fighters so effectively that attacking required accepting suicidal losses. Their pilots had learned to fight at our altitudes, had mastered vertical combat, and possessed aircraft that matched or exceeded ours in every performance category except the jets. The human cost of this prolonged aerial campaign was staggering. The Luftwaffe lost approximately 50,000 aircrew killed during the war, with casualties mounting catastrophically from 1943 onward as the combined American and British bombing offensives intensified. German pilots who survived into the war's final months were often flying with less than 50 hours of training, thrown into combat against American pilots who had logged hundreds of hours and survived multiple combat tours. The results were predictable and tragic. Fresh German pilots lasted an average of just 7 combat missions before being killed or captured. American losses were also severe. The United States Army Air Forces lost approximately 40,000 aircrew in the European theater, but the replacement system ensured that bomber and fighter units maintained operational strength even after catastrophic losses. This was the mathematics of attrition warfare playing out at 30,000 feet, and Germany was losing. Individual German aces could still achieve remarkable success, but exceptional individual performance could not overcome systemic disadvantages in training, numbers, and logistics. The desperate introduction of ramming tactics in 1945, where specially trained German pilots deliberately crashed their fighters into American bombers, demonstrated how far the Luftwaffe had fallen from its days of supremacy. These Sonderkommando Elbe pilots were volunteers, often motivated by patriotism or rage over the destruction of German cities, but their sacrifice achieved little beyond demonstrating that courage without adequate resources was merely tragic rather than effective. In the final months of the war, as Allied armies pushed into Germany from east and west, German pilots found themselves engaged in a hopeless struggle to defend a nation that had already effectively lost. Some continued fighting out of loyalty to their comrades, others from a sense of military duty divorced from politics. A few, particularly those who had joined the Luftwaffe before the Nazi seizure of power, fought simply because they knew no other life. Their continued resistance inflicted casualties on American bomber crews and fighter pilots, but could not alter the war's outcome. May 8, 1945. The guns finally fell silent across Europe as Germany surrendered unconditionally. In prisoner of war camps, airfields, and ruined cities, German pilots who had survived the war faced an uncertain future. The Luftwaffe as an institution had ceased to exist. The men who had flown for it were now prisoners, refugees, or corpses. But the experiences they had accumulated over 6 years of warfare, particularly their encounters with American airmen, would shape military aviation thinking for decades to come. In the immediate post-war period, Allied intelligence services conducted extensive interviews with captured German pilots, seeking to understand how the Luftwaffe had been defeated and what lessons could be extracted from the conflict. These interviews, now archived in military history repositories in the United States, Britain, and Germany, revealed a complex picture of German attitudes toward their American opponents. The crude stereotypes of propaganda had long since evaporated in the crucible of combat. What remained was professional respect mixed with frustration at having been overwhelmed by material and numerical advantages they could not match. Adolf Galland, writing his memoirs in the late 1950s, devoted considerable attention to assessing American air power. He acknowledged that German fighter pilots had initially underestimated their American counterparts, a mistake that cost lives and advantaged the enemy. The Americans brought to aerial warfare the same industrial and organizational capabilities that had made their nation an economic superpower, Galland wrote. They standardized training, optimized logistics, and accepted that victory in modern war required treating combat as a vast industrial process rather than a series of individual duels. We Germans excelled at creating individual heroes. The Americans excelled at creating victory. This observation cut to the heart of why Germany lost the air war. The Luftwaffe produced numerous aces with extraordinary individual kill scores. Erich Hartmann alone achieved 350 52 confirmed victories, but these impressive statistics could not compensate for systemic weaknesses in aircraft production, pilot training, fuel supply, and strategic planning. America produced competent pilots in vast numbers, equipped them with excellent aircraft maintained by efficient logistics networks, and employed them in campaigns designed to achieve specific strategic objectives. When Germany's individual excellence collided with America's systematic superiority, the outcome was inevitable. Many German pilots who survived the war went on to significant post-war careers, often in the newly formed West German Luftwaffe established in 1955. They carried with them lessons learned from fighting American airmen, lessons that influenced NATO air doctrine during the Cold War. The Americans had demonstrated that control of the air required more than superior tactics or brave pilots. It demanded industrial capacity, technological innovation, comprehensive training systems, and most crucially, the ability to sustain operations over years rather than months. The personal relationships that occasionally developed between former enemies provided some of the war's most poignant epilogues. Franz Stigler and Charles Brown, the German and American pilots whose December 1942 encounter had defied military logic, reunited in 1990 and became close friends until Stigler's death in 2008. Their story, documented in the book A Higher Call, illustrated that even in history's most destructive conflict, human decency could survive. Other German and American pilots established similar friendships in the post-war years, attending reunions and sharing memories that both sides understood in ways that non-combatants never could. The German perspective on American pilots ultimately evolved from dismissive contempt through grudging respect to a complex appreciation of an enemy who fought with courage, determination, and the backing of history's most powerful industrial economy. German pilots learned that American airmen were not the soft, incompetent opponents promised by propaganda but formidable adversaries who improved with each engagement. They learned that individual skill, while important, could not overcome systematic advantages in resources and organization. Most painfully, they learned that even the most heroic resistance eventually fails when facing overwhelming material and numerical superiority. This recognition shaped post-war military thinking in profound ways. The NATO alliance that emerged from World War II incorporated both American and German military traditions, blending German tactical sophistication with American organizational and industrial capabilities. Former enemies who had fought each other over European skies found themselves allies against a new threat from the Soviet Union. The lessons of the air war, purchased at tremendous cost by both sides, became foundational doctrine for modern air forces worldwide. In the end, what Germans really thought about American pilots was inseparable from what they learned about modern warfare itself. Individual courage and skill remained important, but victory in industrialized conflict required resources, organization, and persistence on a scale that transcended traditional military virtues. The Americans had mastered this new reality. The Germans had not. The sky over Europe bore witness to the consequences, written in contrails, bullet holes, and the wreckage of thousands of aircraft flown by men who deserved better than the war their leaders had started.